Okay, how's it going, everybody? So we're going to read some more Karl Marx today. This is this is a part of the Civil War in France, and it is France Capitulates and the government of Thiers. So this is a third address, May 1871. Let's go ahead. Let's do some notes first. They got quite a bit of notes here. Um, yeah, let's get into these notes real quick. It says A. In England, common criminals are often discharged on parole after serving the greater part of their term and are placed under police surveillance. On such discharge, they receive a certificate called ticket of leave. Their possessor is being referred to as ticket of leaveman. It says A. Société Générale du Crédit Mobilier, a large French joint stock bank founded in 1852. Its main source of income was speculation in securities. The bank was closely linked with the government circles of the Second Empire. In 1867, it went bankrupt and was liquidated in 1871. B. On February 14th and 15th, 1831, the Paris mob plundered the church of Saint Herman, Aurisson Archbishop Kélin's palace, in protest against the legitimist demonstration during the Requiem Mass for the Duc de Berry. Thiers, who was present among the rioting crowd while it was committing excesses in the church and in the Archbishop's palace, persuaded the French National Guards not to interfere. In 1832, by the order of Thiers, it was at that time Minister of the Interior, the Duchesse de Berry, mother of the Comte de Chambord, the legitimate pretender to the French throne, was arrested and subjected to a humiliating medical examination aimed at giving publicity to her secret marriage and in this way ruling her political career. C. In allusion to the ignominious role of Thiers, then Minister of the Interior, in suppressing the people's insurrection in Paris against the July monarchy on April 13th to 14th, 1834. The insurrection was put down with savage brutality by the military who, for example, massacred the inhabitants of one of the houses on Rue Transnonain. September laws, reactionary laws against the press introduced by the French government in September 1835. They provided for imprisonment and large fines for publications criticizing the existing social and political systems. D. In January 1841, Thiers submitted to the Chamber of Deputies a plan for building a range of military fortifications around Paris. Revolutionary Democratic sections saw this move as a preparatory step for the crushing of popular demonstrations. The plan provided for the building of particularly strong fortifications in the vicinity of the workers' district. E. In April 1849, France, in conjunction with Austria and Naples, organized an intervention campaign against the Republic of Rome in order to crush it and restore the Pope's temporal power. French troops severely bombarded Rome. Despite heroic resistance, the Republic was crushed and Rome occupied by French troops. F. Party of Order. A party of the influential conservative bourgeoisie, founded in 1848. It was a coalition of the two French monarchist factions, the Legitimists and Orleanists. From 1849 until the coup d'etat of December 2nd, 1851, it held the leading position in the Legislative Assembly of the Second Republic. G. On July 15, 1840, England, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Turkey signed the London Convention without the participation of France on rendering aid to the Turkish Sultan against the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali, who had the support of France. As a result, a threat of war arose between France and the coalition of European powers, but King Louis Philippe did not dare begin hostilities and abandoned his support of Muhammad Ali. H. In order to suppress the Paris Commune, Thiers appealed to Bismarck for permission to supplement the Versailles army with French prisoners of war, most of whom had been serving in the armies that surrendered at Sedan and Metz. I. Chamber of Deputies in France in 1815 and 1816, during the early years of Restoration, which consisted of extreme reactionaries. Landlord Chamber, the Assembly of Rules, a nickname of the National Assembly of 1871, which met in Bordeaux, It was largely made up of reactionary monarchists, provincial landlords, officials, rentiers, and traders elected in rural districts. There were about 430 monarchists against the Assembly's 630 deputies. K. The preliminary peace treaty between France and Germany, signed at Versailles on February 26, 1871, by Thiers and Jules Favre on the one hand and Bismarck on the other. According to the terms of this treaty, France ceded Alsace and East Lorraine to Germany and paid it indemnities to the sum of 5 billion francs. The final peace treaty was signed in Frankfurt on May 10, 1871. L. On March 10, 1871, the National Assembly passed the law on the deferred payment of overdue bills. Under this law, the payment of debts on obligations concluded between August 13th and November 12, 1870, could be deferred. Thus, law led to the bankruptcy of many petty bourgeoisie. Decien Brescier, a participant in the Bonapartist coup d'etat of December 2nd, 1851, and a supporter of acts in the spirit of this coup. N. According to the newspapers, the internal loan, which the Thiers government wanted to float, gave Thiers and members of his government over 300 million francs commission. On June 20th, 1871, after the suppression of the Paris Commune, the law on the loan was passed. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this. This is France Capitulates and the government of Thiers. In September 4th, 1870, when the working men of Paris proclaimed the Republic, which was almost instantaneously acclaimed throughout France, without a single voice of dissent, a cabal of place-hunting barristers, with Thiers for their statesman, and Trochu for their general, took hold of the Hôtel de Ville. At the time, they were imbued with so fanatical a faith in the mission of Paris to represent France in all epochs of historical crisis that, to legitimate their usurped titles as governors of France, they thought it quite sufficient to produce their lapse mandates as representatives of Paris. In our second address on the late war, 5 days after the rise of these men, we told you who they were. Yet in the turmoil of surprise, with the real leaders of the working class still shut up in Bonapartist prisons, and the Prussians already marching on Paris, Paris bore with their assumption of power on the express condition that it was to be wielded for the single purpose of national defense. Paris, however, was not to be defended without arming its working class, organizing them into an effective force, and training their ranks by the war itself. But Paris' arm was the revolution arm. A victory of Paris over the Prussian aggressor would have been a victory of the French workmen over the French capitalists and estate parasites. In this conflict between national duty and class interest, the government of national defense did not hesitate one moment to turn into a government of national defection. The first step they took was to send Thiers on a roving tour to all the courts of Europe, there to beg mediation by offering the barter of the Republic for a king. 4 months after the commencement of the siege of Paris, when they thought the opportune moment came for breaking the word of capitulation, Trochu, in the presence of Jules Favre and others of his colleagues, addressed the assembled mayors of Paris on these terms. Quote, "The first question put to me by my colleagues on the very evening of the 4th of September was this: Paris, can it, with any chance of success, stand a siege by the Prussian army? I did not hesitate to answer in the negative. Some of my colleagues here present will warrant the truth of my words and the persistence of my opinion. I told them, in these very terms, that under the existing state of things, the attempt of Paris to hold out a siege by the Prussian army would be a folly. Without doubt, I added, it would be an heroic folly, but that would be all. The events, managed by himself, have not given the lie to my provision." End quote. This nice little speech of Trochu was afterwards published by M. Carbon, one of the mayors present. Thus, on the very evening of the proclamation of the Republic, Trochu's plan was known to his colleagues to be the capitulation of Paris. If national defense has been more than a pretext for the personal government of Thiers, Favre and Company, the upstarts of September 4th would have been abdicated on the 4th, would have initiated the Paris people into Trochu's plan, and called upon them to surrender at once, or to take their own fate into their own hand. Instead of this, the infamous impostors resolved upon curing the heroic folly of Paris by a regimen of famine and broken heads, and to dupe her in the meanwhile by writing manifestos, holding forth that Trochu, quote, the governor of Paris will never capitulate, end quote. And Jules Favre, the foreign minister, will, quote, not cede an inch of our territory, nor a stone of our fortresses, end quote. In a letter to Gambetta, the very same Jules Favre avows that they were, quote, defending against were not the Prussian soldiers, but the working men of Paris. During the whole continuance of the siege, the Bonapartist cutthroats, whom Trochu had wisely entrusted with the command of the Paris army, exchanged in their intimate correspondence ribald jokes at the well-understood mockery of defense. See, for instance, the correspondent of Alphonse Simon Guillaud, supreme commander of the artillery of the Army of Defense of Paris, and the Grand Cross of the Legion Honor to Suzanne, General of Division of Artillery, a correspondence published by the Journal Officiel of the Commune. The mask of the true heroism was at last dropped on January 28, 1871. With the true heroism of utter self-debasement, the government of national defense and their capitulation came out as the government of France's Bismarck prisoners, a part so base that Louis Bonaparte himself had, at Sedan, shrunk from accepting it. After the events of March 18th, on their wild flight to Versailles, the Capitulates left in the hands of Paris the documentary evidence of their treason, to destroy which, as the Commune says in its manifesto to the provinces, quote, those men would not recoil from battering Paris into a heap of ruins washed by a sea of blood, end quote. To be eagerly bent upon such consummation, some of the leading members of the government of defense had, besides most peculiar reasons of their own. Shortly after the conclusion of the armistice, M. Millier, one of the representatives of Paris to the National Assembly, now shot by express orders of Jules Favre, published a series of authentic legal documents and proof that Jules Favre, living in concubinage with the wife of a drunken resident at Algiers, had, by a most daring concoction of forgeries spread over many years, contrived to grasp in the name of the children of his adultery a large succession, which made him a rich man, and that in a lawsuit undertaken by the legitimate heirs, he only escaped exposure by the connivance of the Bonapartist tribunals. As these dry legal documents were not got rid of by any amount of rhetorical horsepower, Jules Favre, for the first time in his life, held his tongue, quietly awaiting the outbreak of the Civil War, in order, then, frantically to denounce the people of Paris as a band of escaped convicts in utter revolt against family, religion, order, and property. This same forger had hardly got into power after September 4th, when he sympathetically let loose upon society Pic and Taillefer, convicted, even under the empire, of forgery in the scandalous affair of, quote-unquote, Étendard. One of these men, Taillefer, having dared to return to Paris under the Commune, was at once reinstated in prison, and then Jules Favre exclaimed from the tribune of the National Assembly that Paris was setting free all her jailbirds. Ernest Picard, the Joe Miller of the government of national defense, who appointed himself finance minister of the Republic after having in vain striven to become home minister of the empire, is the brother of one Arthur Picard, an individual expelled from the Paris Beaucaire as a blackleg. See report to the Prefecture of Police dated July 13, 1867, and convicted on his own confession of death 300,000 francs while manager of one of the branches of the Société Générale, Rue Palestro, number 5. See report of the Prefecture of Police dated December 11, 1868. This Arthur Picard was made by Ernest Picard, the editor of his paper, Electeur Libre. While the common run of stock jobbers were led astray by the official lies of the finance office paper, Arthur was running backwards and forwards between the finance office and the bourse, there to the discount of the disasters of the French army. The whole financial correspondence of that worthy pair of brothers fell into the hands of the Commune. Jules Ferry, a penniless barrister, before September 4th, contrived, as mayor of Paris during the siege, to job a fortune out of famine. The day on which he would have to give an account to his maladministration would be the day of his conviction. These men, then, could find in the ruins of Paris only their tickets of leave. They were the very men Bismarck wanted. With the help of some shuffling of cards, Thiers, hitherto the secret prompter of the government, now appeared at its head, with the tickets of leave men for his ministers. Thiers, the monstrous gnome, had had charmed the French bourgeoisie for almost half a century, because he is the most consummate intellectual expression of their own class corruption. Before he became a statesman, he already proved his lying powers as a historian. The chronicle of his public life is the record of the misfortunes of France. Banded before 1830 with the Republicans, he slipped into office under Louis Philippe by betraying his protector, Lafayette, ingratiating himself with the king by exciting mob riots against the clergy, during which the church of Saint Herman Leroy, I think it's Leroy, and the archbishop's palace were plundered, and by acting the minister spy upon, in the jail accoucheur of the Duchess de Berry. The massacre of the Republicans in Rue Transnonain and the subsequent infamous laws of September against the press and the right of association were his work. Reappearing as the chief of cabinet in March 1840, he astonished France with his plan for fortifying France. To the Republicans, who denounced this plan as a sinister plot against the liberty of Paris, he replied from the tribune of the Chamber of Deputies, quote, "What? To fancy any works of fortification could ever endanger liberty. And first of all, you calumniate any possible government in supposing that it could someday attempt to maintain itself by bombarding the capital, but that the government would be 100 times more impossible after its victory than before. Indeed, no government would ever have dared to bombard Paris from the forts, save that government which had previously surrendered these forts to the Prussians. When King Bomba, Ferdinand II of Spain, tried his hand at Palermo in July 1848, Thiers, then long since out of office, again rose in the Chamber of Deputies. Quote, "You know, gentlemen, what is happening at Palermo. You all of you, shake with horror in the parliamentary sense on hearing that during the 48 hours a large town has been bombarded. By whom? Was it a foreign enemy exercising the rights of war? No, gentlemen, it was by its own government. And why? Because the unfortunate town demanded its rights. Well then, for the demand of its rights, it has got 48 hours of bombardment. Allow me to appeal to the opinion of Europe. It is doing a service to mankind to arise and make reverberate from what is perhaps the greatest tribune in Europe some words, indeed words, of indignation against such acts. When the regent Espartu, who had rendered services to his country, which M. Thiers never did, that's in parentheses, which M. Thiers never did, intended bombarding Barcelona in order to suppress its insurrection, there arose from all parts of the world a general outcry of indignation." End quote. 18 months afterwards, M. Thiers was amongst the fiercest defenders of the bombardment of Rome by a French army. In fact, the fault of King Bomba seems to have consisted in this only, that he limited his bombardment to 48 hours. A few days before the February Revolution, fretting at the long exile from Place and Pelf to which Guizot had condemned him, and sniffing in the air at the scent of an approaching popular commotion, Thiers, in that pseudo-heroic style which won him the nickname Mirabeau Mouche, Mirabeau the Fly, declared to the Chamber of Deputies, quote, "I am of the party of revolution, not only in France but in Europe. I wish the government of the revolution to remain in the hands of moderate men. But if that government should fall into the hand of ardent minds, even into those of radicals, I shall, for all that, not desert my cause. I shall always be of the party of the revolution." End quote. The February Revolution came. Instead of displacing the Guizot cabinet by the Thiers cabinet, as the little man had dreamed, it superseded Louis Philippe by the Republic. On the first day of the popular victory, he carefully hid himself, forgetting that the contempt of the working men screened him from their hatred. Still, with his legendary courage, he continued to shy the public stage until the June 1848 massacres had cleared it up for his sort of action. Then he became the leading mind of, quote, "the party of order," end quote, in its parliamentary republic. That anonymous interregnum in which all the rival factions of the ruling class conspired together to crush the people and conspired against each other to restore to each of them its own monarchy. Then as now, Thiers denounced the Republicans as the only obstacle to the consolidation of the Republic. Then as now, he spoke to the Republic as the hangman spoke to Don Carlos. Quote, "I shall assassinate thee, but for thy own good," end quote. Now as then, he will have to exclaim on the day after his victory, L'Empire est fait, the empire is consummated. Despite his hypocritical homilies about the necessary liberties, and his personal grudge against Louis Bonaparte, who had made a dupe of him and kicked out of parliamentarism, and outside of its factitious atmosphere, the little man is conscious of withering into nothingness. He had a hand in all the infamies of the Second Empire, from the occupation of Rome by French troops to the war with Prussia, which he incited by his fierce invective against Germany unity, not as a cloak of Prussian despotism, but as an encroachment upon the vested right of France in German disunion. Fond of brandishing with his dwarfish arms in the face of Europe the sword of the first Napoleon, whose historical shoeblack he had become, his foreign policy always culminated in the utter humiliation of France, from the London Convention of 1840 to the Paris Capitulation of 1871, in the present Civil War, where he hounds on the prisoners of Sedan and Metz, against Paris by special permission of Bismarck. Despite his versatility of talent and shiftiness of purpose, this man has his whole lifetime been wedded to the most fossil routine. It is self-evident that to him the deeper undercurrents of modern society remain forever hidden. But even the most palpable changes on its surface were abhorrent to a brain, all the vitality of which had fled to the tongue. Thus, he never tired of denouncing as a sacrilege any deviation from the old French protective system. When a minister of Louis Philippe, he railed at railways as a wild chimera, and when in opposition under Louis Bonaparte, he branded a profanation every attempt to reform the rotten French army system. Never in his long political career has he been guilty of a single, even the smallest measure of any practical use. Thiers was consistent only in his greed for wealth and his hatred for the men that produce it. Having entered his first ministry under Louis Philippe, poor as Job, he left it a millionaire. His last ministry under the same king of March 1st, 1840, exposed him to the public taunts of peculation in the Chamber of Deputies, to which he was content to reply by tears. A commodity he deals in as freely as Jules Favre or any other crocodile. At Bordeaux, his first measure for saving France from impending financial ruin was to endow himself with 3 millions a year. The first and the last word of the, quote, economic republic, end quote, the vista of which he had opened to his Paris electors in 1869. One of his former colleagues of the Chamber of Deputies of 1830, himself a capitalist, and, nevertheless, a devoted member of the Paris Commune, M. Beslay, lately addressed Thiers thus in a public placard. Quote, the enslavement of labor by capital has always been the cornerstone of your policy. From the very day you saw the Republic of Labor installed at Hotel de Ville, you have never ceased to cry out to France, these are criminals, end quote. A master in a small state roguery, a virtuoso in perjury and treason, a craftsman in all the petty stratagems, cunning devices, and base perfidies of parliamentary warfare, never scrupling, when out of office, to fan a revolution, and to stifle it in blood when at the helm of the state, with class prejudices standing him in the place of ideas, and vanity in the place of a heart, his private life as infamous as his republic life is odious. Even now, when playing the part of French Sulla, he cannot help setting off the abomination of his deeds by the ridicule of his ostentation. The capitulation of Paris by surrendering to Prussia not only Paris but all France closed the long-continued intrigues of treason with the enemy, which the usurpers of September 4th had begun, as Trochu himself said. On the very same day, on the other hand, it initiated the Civil War. On the very same day. On the other hand, it initiated the civil war they were now to wage, with the assistance of Prussia, against the Republic in Paris. The trap was laid in the very terms of the capitulation. At that time, above 1/3 of the territory was in the hands of the enemy. The capital was cut off from the provinces. All communications were disorganized. To elect, under such circumstances, a real representation of France was impossible, unless ample time were given for preparation. In view of this, the capitulation stipulated that a National Assembly must be elected within 8 days, so that in many parts of France the news of the impending election arrived on its eve only. This assembly, moreover, was, by an express clause of the capitulation, to be elected for the sole purpose of deciding on peace or war. and eventually to conclude a treaty of peace. The population could not but feel that the terms of the armistice rendered the continuation of the war impossible, and that for sanctioning the peace imposed by Bismarck, the worst men in France were the best. But not content with these precautions, Thiers, even before the secret of the armistice had been broached to Paris, set out for an electioneering tour through the provinces, there to galvanize back into life the legitimist party, which now, along with the Orleanists, had to take the place of the then impossible Bonapartists. He was not afraid of them, impossible as a government of modern France, and therefore contemptible as rivals. What party were more eligible as tools of counter-revolution than the party whose action, in the word of Thiers himself, Chamber of Deputies, January 5th, 1833, quote, had always been confined to the three resources of foreign invasion, civil war, and anarchy, end quote. They verily believed in the advent of their long-expected retrospective millennium. There were the hills of foreign invasion trampling upon France. There was the downfall of an empire and the captivity of Bonaparte. And there they were themselves. The wheel of history had evidently rolled back to stop at the, quote, chambers introuvables, end quote, of 1816. In the assemblies of the Republic, 1848 to 1851, they had been represented by their educated and trained parliamentary champions. It was the rank and file of the party which now rushed in, all pourcenacs of France. A character in one of Moliere's comedies typifying the dull-witted, narrow-minded, petty-landed gentry, end quote. That was all in quotes. That was all an extra note, which I guess the poor Canucks, the poor Canucks, I think that's how you say it. As soon as this assembly of quote-unquote rules had met at Bordeaux, Thiers made it clear to them that peace preliminaries must be assented to at once, without even the honors of parliamentary debate, as the only conditions on which Prussia would permit them to open the war against the Republic in Paris, its stronghold. The counter-revolution had, in fact, no time to lose. The Second Empire had more than doubled the national debt and plunged all the large towns into the heavy municipal debts. The war had fearfully swelled the liabilities and mercilessly ravaged the resources of the nation. To complete the ruin, the Prussian Shylock was there with his bond for the keep of 500,000 of his soldiers on French soil, his indemnity for 5 millions, and interest at 5% on the unpaid installments thereof. Who was to pay this bill? It was only by the violent overthrow of the Republic that the appropriators of wealth could hope to shift onto the shoulders of its producers the cost of a war which they, the appropriators, had themselves originated. Thus, the immense ruin of France spurred on these patriotic representatives of land and capital, under the very eyes of patronage of the invader, to graft upon the foreign war a civil war, a slaveholders' rebellion. There stood in the way of this conspiracy one great obstacle: Paris. To disarm Paris was the first condition of success. Paris was therefore summoned by Thiers to surrender its arms. Then Paris was exasperated by the frantic anti-republican demonstrations of the quote-unquote rule assembly and by Thiers' own equivocations about the legal status of the Republic, by the threat to decapitate and decapitalize Paris, the appointment of Orleanist ambassadors, Dufour's law on overdue commercial bills and house rents, inflicting ruin on the commerce and industry of Paris per Courtier's tax of 2 centimes upon every copy of every imaginable publication, the sentences of death against Blanqui in Florence, the suppression of the Republican journals, the transfer of the National Assembly to Versailles, the renewal of the state of siege declared by Palicao and expired on September 4th, the appointment of Vinoy, the Deciem Brassier, as government of Paris, of Valentin, the imperialist gendarme as its prefect of police, and Diarès de Paladin, the Jesuit general and the commander-in-chief of its National Guard. And now we have to address a question to M. Thiers and the men of national defense, his understrappers. It is known that, through the agency of Empereur Courtier, his finance ministers, Thiers had contracted a loan of 2 milliards. Now, is it true or not, 1, that the business was so managed that a consideration of several hundred millions was secured for the private benefit of Thiers, Jules Favre, Ernest Picard, Poirier Courtier, and Jules Simon, and 2, that no money was to be paid down until after the quote-unquote pacification of Paris. At all events, there must have been something very pressing in the matter for Thiers and Jules Favre. In the name of the majority of the Bordeaux Assembly, unblushingly solicited the immediate occupation of Paris by Prussian troops. Such, however, was not the game of Bismarck, as he sneeringly and in public told the admiring Frankfurt Philistines on his return to Germany. Okay, yeah. So that was France Capitulates in the Government of Thiers, written by Marx. That was the third address on the Civil War in France, written May 1871. So yeah, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxists, so y'all can hit me up there. Y'all have a great day, and the Dadagoy.